Hi, everyone. It's so good to be with you this evening as we consider the final video in our series, Rule of Life, Living Life with Intention. So, just to remind you where we've been as we've walked this road together, we began by considering what a rule of life might offer in terms of drawing our attention to being very intentional with developing a listening heart and becoming attuned to the work of God in our midst and the life that we're being called to lead. And after we contemplated what listening, intentional listening might be, we walked through the topic of being, of gratitude and boundaries and work and love and creativity and Sabbath and forgiveness. And then we thought together through vulnerability, those things that draw us together as human beings, but things that are painful. They're teachers in our lives, but teachers that most of us probably wish that we could avoid, things like suffering and fear and grief and loss. But remembering that our human family shares those things and those experiences in common. And when we address them with attentive and listening hearts, they can become means through which God speaks to us and works in our lives in very powerful ways. We talked about body, about health and play and home and intimacy. We thought together about discernment and discretion, about becoming aware of those things, that sort of recording that constantly is playing in our minds, and how we can become attentive to those things that aren't helpful in our thought patterns and replace them with things that are more constructive and fruitful and life-giving. And today we're going to talk about what Charles LaFond in his book calls existence, but I prefer to think of as legacy. These are things that are core values to the way that he wants to live. And there's an invitation to think through whether they're values that we share, if there are other values you might name for yourself, but also think through the way that you want to be remembered and the legacy that you hope to leave. All of us will have made an imprint in the world during our time here. And while we would often prefer to avoid thinking about the end of life is part of our design. Our life on this earth will have a beginning and an end. And there's a question of what do we hope that we have left behind, the way that we've lived our lives. How do we hope that things will be better or different? Or how do we hope that we'll be remembered? What kind of legacy do we hope to leave? So underneath this topic that he calls existence, and I call legacy, he has 5 topics: kindness and beauty, planet, money and philanthropy, and solitude. Now, when he talks about kindness, it's such a lovely reminder. Our world is really not structured to invite us to think about kindness or gentleness or compassion. We're often told that we're competing with one another and that we better compete because the pie is super small. And so if we don't get our own slice, it's going to be gone before we get there. And I like pie, so I want to compete. But actually, that whole thing's a myth. There's plenty of pie for everybody. We don't have to fight with one another in the way that our world tells us we need to. That hyper competitiveness is really destructive. And LaFond invites us to reorient to kindness and gentleness and compassion. And it's interesting. Um, I think that kindness and gentleness, compassion, forgiveness, these are things that we can all use more of. And it has seemed to me on a number of occasions that the measure of compassion and kindness that we're able to give to others, to share with others, is related. There's a connection to the amount of kindness and compassion we're able to exercise with ourselves. And cultivating kindness and compassion with ourselves draws our attention to the sort of hidden life that many of us lead, the way that we really don't know what struggles people are undergoing when we encounter them, and drawing our attention to the importance of kindness and compassion and cultivating that virtue. It means that we have to learn to set aside other values that we might want to give primacy to. So for LaFont, he says that he has decided he would rather be known for being kind than for being pious or blameless or being right. I'll say for myself, there are times when I really like being right, and I'm willing to go to great lengths to demonstrate how right I am. But there are times when those lengths are actually not constructive or fruitful or helpful, where they can actually tear people down instead of build them up. And so LaFond invites our reflection into the kind of person, the kind of people that we want to be. Am I somebody who would rather be kind or be right? And the truth is, I would rather be kind, but that requires intention and is not something that is going to come naturally to me if I don't cultivate that virtue. And so thinking through kindness as more important, as the most important guiding value for him, reorients him. And he has a lovely sort of note where he says, when I read that chapter, I'm reminded that that's the kind of person I want to be. So when you think about kindness or whatever virtue it is that you feel is the core virtue for your life, something that invites you to live with integrity and something that you would want to be remembered for, a sort of legacy level virtue, to write a chapter that when you read it, you also say, oh, yeah, that's the person I want to be. So the chapter is both an expression of hope and an invitation to live differently. So the second of the 5 topics that LaFond discusses is beauty. And he talks about the Hebrew tov, the word that is used for creation, that that creation is intrinsically beautiful. And there's also a discussion on eros. He has a quote that says, at the root of beauty is eros, a primordial impulse that guides us to what we desire. Eros is a chemical and spiritual response to any beauty. In your chapter on beauty, there is an invitation to think about orienting yourself away from those parts of our world that are ugly and cruel, that acknowledging those parts of our world may be important, but being steeped in them, having them be your central focus, is really damaging to your soul that was created to honor the beauty of this world, the beauty of creation. When we were in the middle of our live stream for church a couple of weeks ago, I had a vase of flowers sitting on our table, and I looked over, and with the candles and the flowers, and a single petal had dropped inside the vase, and it was so stunning. I actually got distracted by how beautiful it was. And fortunately, my role in that service wasn't too great for me to be able to pause and take a picture so that I could look and reflect on how beautiful that was. And one of the practices for me in appreciating beauty is pausing to take pictures like that. And when I'm overwhelmed or exhausted or feeling a little burnt out, one of the joys in my life is being able to go through my own photo stream and remember some really beautiful moments that I've enjoyed. So LaFond actually tells us, he invites us to use this chapter to orient ourselves to the beauty in our midst, the people that we love and the pets that we love, the flowers in a vase on our table, the way the light dapples in the trees, gorgeous Arizona sunsets. He says, I have a chapter on beauty to remember to look for it, to create it, and encourage others to make it. The chapter reminds me also to spend my time with people who love beauty and not with people who are blind to it, because life is so short. And turning our attention back to an awareness of the incredible beauty with which creation is imbued is an important practice right now. And to surround ourselves with people who also appreciate that beauty and who are motivated by that beauty and creation is really important. The world can be very disorienting, but it is a beautiful place. And a chapter that reminds you to find beauty where you are can be very helpful in nurturing our souls. So LaFond's reflection on the beauty in creation sort of naturally draws him into awareness of the beauty of our planet. And so his next section following beauty is on planet. He talks about care for creation and the magnitude of beauty on our planet he sees in great and tiny things. And he thinks of himself as a caretaker here for a short time and talks about the legacy that he hopes to leave for the children that he loves in his caretaking. So he thinks about how to act with integrity in ways great and small so that he treats this beautiful planet gently and tenderly, acknowledging its resilience and its beauty and its fragility and the kinds of things that he hopes exist and for generations to come. He talks about not just the beautiful fragility of our planet and how stunning it is, but he also talks about places he wants to go, places that he's been that he loves, foods that he's tried that he loves, food that he wants to try. His chapter on planet has a very sort of tactile sense to it. So it's both ephemeral and feeling and full of his hopes, but it's also a statement of what he loves about this planet and what he loves experiencing and what he hopes to experience in the future. And he invites us to do the same thing, to make a record of those things that we value about this place that we love, this planet that we live on together. What makes it wonderful? And how can we preserve those things that make it wonderful, but how can we also enjoy them and experience them during our time on this planet? And with that, he moves to money and philanthropy. So, money and philanthropy is an interesting sort of um, chapter because he says it both soothes him and annoys him. So, I really appreciated his honesty with that because I think thinking about money can both soothe and annoy many of us. He talks about, first of all, that we need money to live and that there's no denying that. So, having work that is that has integrity and Um, being able to live, of course, is important. But he also talks about living within our means. And I was reflecting on that. Um, debt is um, truly distorting. It really influences our holy imagination. It influences our imagination in a lot of ways, but debt in particular influences our holy imagination because it limits what we think that we're able to do as we respond to God. And so our financial constraints, of course, are real, and we all have budgets and needs that need to be met. And we ought to be responsible with our money. But living within our means becomes not just an exercise in sort of fiscal responsibility, but an exercise in stewardship of the gifts that God has given us. So the hope is that if you've not been in debt, you stay out of debt, and that if you're in debt, that you turn your energy into what a faithful response would be to move out of debt. And that if you find yourself in the position where you do need to take on debt, that you do it responsibly. So not just an issue of, like I said, not just an issue of being fiscally responsible, but there's an element of spirituality and stewardship and an element of constraint to our holy imaginations if we don't take our budget and stewardship responsibly and take it seriously. For LaFond, he actually talks about naming his desires. So he names his hope to be financially independent. And what that means for him is that he wants to save half of what he earns. That is not a position that I can take myself, but it's an important position to name what your hope is and to think about how you can move towards that hope. The other thing that LaFond does, and I share this because I think it's wise. He says not everybody has this issue. It's not an issue for me personally, but there's an issue of impulse buying where there's a false sense of control or a sort of jolt of excitement that he gets when he purchases something. And I thought that was such an interesting acknowledgement from somebody who has lived life as a monk and lives very simply. But he said that when he's stressed, his first impulse is to buy something. And I thought, well, he's human too. So his response to that is to put a 24-hour limit on any purchase that he didn't intend to make. So if he sees something that he wants, he has to wait 24 hours. And by the time that 24 hours is up, he's almost always moved on. So thinking about your own lived experience with money and putting some boundaries, sort of naming hopes, thinking about how you can live into those hopes, and putting some boundaries that make sense for you to be healthy and for you to take care of what's most important to you in terms of your responsibilities. It's an important chapter, but he also talks in this chapter about philanthropy, which he says is Greek for lover of humans, and says that that's the kind of person he wants to be, a lover of humans. And so he talks about how our brains literally light up when we give to others, and especially if we're helping to meet their basic needs for survival. and how having both a responsible budget and also a way that we can contribute to the well-being of others is really important. And so thinking through what that stewardship looks like for you, whether it's money that you're giving, um, which if you have the means to do is an important component of stewardship. If you have the time that you can give, the talent that you can give, we have so many lovely volunteers that do such lovely work in their ministries at St. Augustine's. But having something that you do with intention that is helpful to the well-being of others, that contributes to the well-being of others, is important not only for them but also for you. That it's something we're created to do. The way our brains light up when we give to others clearly shows that there's something in our makeup that responds positively, that enjoys doing that. So being thoughtful and intentional with that is an invitation in this chapter also. So his last chapter in this section is Solitude. And in this last chapter, he discusses his vision of sort of a circle that we've begun and ended with listening, that we've begun with our intentional listening. And now we turn back to solitude and its importance for our very existence. He says that, this is a quote, he says that some people love solitude and others hate it. But the reality is that life has some, and in our solitude we face our demons. In facing them, we discover our demons are little more than the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz, pulling levers and trying desperately to keep us frightened. He says that every day we need to set aside time, either a little or a lot, to spend alone in solitude. Every day that we spend alone in solitude, we come to know ourselves better. We come to realize that most of those things that keep us frightened or make us feel a lack of hope are actually very small. In our solitude, when we confront those things that we'd rather not confront, we often find that they're not nearly as terrifying as we expected them to be. And in those moments, in our solitude, if we do encounter things that are bigger than we can handle on our own, we have resources. So the response ought not be to sort of clam up and shut down and act as though those things aren't there. But if there are things that are bigger than we can handle on our own, we have spiritual resources in terms of spiritual direction, our priests, our deacons. We also have access to therapists to help us sort of untangle webs in our lives and to move us closer towards healing. And a rule of life, if nothing else, ought to be a source of healing for us. A way that we can name those things that have caused us pain or fear, and a way that we can prayerfully address them so that we can step away from those places that are sources of wound and move to places of wholeness. A rule of life is an invitation that guides us, that calls us out, calls us to our better self. Lafon says, and this is another quote, Lafon says, "A rule of life helps us to be converted into the people we want to become. It reconnects us with our true selves. And these chapters are a gift from yourself to yourself, and God's voice is within them." So a rule of life helps us to be converted into the people we want to become. It's an invitation, an invitatory process that allows us to sit and contemplate thoughtfully and carefully those things in our lives to which God is calling us. At the end of this chapter, LaFond moves into some suggestions. He says that if you find this sort of approach of taking one chunk at a time to be overwhelming, that it's okay to rather take a week and sit with these topics and imagine for yourself what those topics might look like, if whether these chapters resonate with you or don't. He carries around index cards, which I'm actually a really tactile person myself. I love writing. So he carries index cards, and with those index cards, he makes notes, thinks about these different topics. He says for people who aren't all about the paper, that you can make those notes electronically, but to have a way to sort of think through the chapters as your days go by. So the first week, sort of thinking through the headings in your chapters, and the second week, taking some time to jot some thoughts down with each of those chapters, perhaps reading some, thinking about what sources you can draw from. And then in the third week, beginning to actually do the writing and pulling together the different thoughts that you've had for each of these chapters. And he calls it a lifelong document. So encourages us not to be concerned if we don't, that perfection's not the goal. The goal is writing it. So if you find that taking these a chunk at a time is helpful and just sitting down and doing it is helpful, that's great. But if you don't, there are other ways of doing this. But the hope is that you do it. So whatever method works for you is the right method. So to remind you, there's listening so that God informs our lives. And that Mother Teresa says, God is the friend of silence. So listening is the first heading, and under that is silence and stillness, connection, prayer and meditation, and then anxious thoughts. Then the second major chunk, the second major topic, is being, with gratitude and boundaries and work, love, creativity, Sabbath, and forgiveness. And then the next major heading is vulnerability, with suffering and fear and uncertainty, grief and loss and envy. And with that section in particular, he says that if you find it difficult to write, don't give up, but make notes in the margins of your paper and just keep going. So, for example, if just the thought of suffering makes you feel sort of tense and like you can't move forward with writing, don't stop. Write a couple of notes, a couple of words, and come back to it. And those words will begin to thread together in a chapter. The fourth major heading is body, with health and play and home and intimacy, touch, and sex. Remembering that as we think through body, there is this sort of encouragement to be kind and gentle with yourself, that it's not meant to be a punishing chapter, but also that it's meant to invite us to think about those boundaries that are healthy for us, and those boundaries that invite us to live into our best selves, and to honor our own intrinsic dignity and also the dignity of our brothers and sisters, knowing that we were all made in the image of a very loving God. So if we are all made in the image of God, how do we honor our own boundaries and the boundaries of others, that dignity in ourselves and dignity in others? We move from body to thought with discernment and discretion, our yes and our no, detachment, which is that ability to welcome blessings into our lives but not cling to them so much that we forget that the source of all good things is who we ought to be clinging to. So, welcoming good things into our lives, but remembering that God is the source of all good things. And technology and media, and thinking how we can draw some boundaries around that to help us to be healthy and to honor our needs in a healthy way. Study and formation so that we continue that spark of curiosity, that divine spark of curiosity. And failure, acknowledging that we are imperfect and that there are times that we fail, and asking failure to be our teacher instead of thinking about it as a source of shame. And finally, this last section, existence, or as I've described it as legacy, those things that are central to who we are and those things that we hope, that imprint that we hope that we've left on the world. How do we want to live in this world? And for LaFond, it's kindness is given primacy, and beauty and our care for the planet, but also our pleasure in the planet, money and philanthropy. So thinking about how we steward our resources so that we can best live into the people that God has called us to be. And coming full circle to solitude so that we can continue to listen to the voice of God, continue to adjust, continue to try to live more faithfully into who God is calling us to be. And friends, this is a process that continues throughout life, lifelong invitation to be attuned to God's voice in your midst, to what God is calling you to, and our awareness of what God is calling us to, and the different things God calls us to in different seasons of our lives. Those things can change, and so this is a living document. Your rule of life is a living document. It is not meant to be static. It is not meant to be perfect. It's meant to coach you, to remind you of who you want to be, to invite you into that prayerful reflection, invite you to attune yourself to the voice of God, and also to be aware that as we grow and change, our awareness in these different topics may also grow and change. And so don't be afraid to make edits as you go, as life calls you into different things in different seasons. And it has been such a joy to walk with you through this process, and I hope that it is life-giving and fruitful. And I hope that in your own reflection for your rule of life, that you find joy and self-discovery, and that there are good things that come from that intentional time set aside for you and for God, and to be in a space where you can reflect on who God is calling you to be. So God bless you. I am so glad to have spent this time with you, and I am so hopeful for your own rule of life, that it helps you live your life with intention. God bless you. Bye.